Dragon Quest XI is the triumphant return of Dragon Quest around the world. It's gorgeous, it's enormous, it's that classic style nobody else does better. And the PS4 version did well enough for Square Enix to announce an international release of the Switch version. For all intents and purposes, it's another fantastic Dragon Quest game. This is AAA level quality, and it shows. Except, well, for one notable, important piece. What the hell happened to the music? The intro features a lush, beautiful, full orchestra, but the rest sounds way off. Forgetting for a moment that the actual new compositions in Dragon Quest are arguably subpar, the majority of the music in Dragon Quest is made up of electronically recorded MIDI samples, which could be okay, but these MIDI samples in particular are of shocking poor quality. Are you kidding me right now? These horns? Is this GoldenEye 64? Or is this a legacy JRPG printed on a Blu-ray disc in 2018? Dragon Quest has a pedigree that almost doesn't need to be mentioned. What's important to remember is that it's so popular in Japan that mainline releases are basically national holidays. The poor quality of these MIDI sample tracks are incredibly disappointing, and aren't up to the standard set by other recent JRPGs, let alone the series that created the JRPG. I understand not wanting to pay for a whole orchestra for your music, but can't you at least get better samples? Surely the series so popular in Japan that they have to release it on a Saturday could... Wait, they did get an orchestra to play it? And it was packed in with a special edition? But it wasn't in the game. Dragon Quest music begins and ends with one man, Koichi Sugiyama. A legend of video games composition, but also a controversial figure with a stranglehold on every aspect of Dragon Quest's music. Welcome to Past Mortem, and today we're going to explore why Koichi Sugiyama would allow such a bad version of his music into Dragon Quest XI. Koichi Sugiyama is literally the oldest game composer in the world. Like Guinness World Record old. Born in 1931, Sugiyama lived in Tokyo until he had to evacuate during World War II. He eventually graduated college and worked as a journalist and TV director until he decided to focus on his true love, writing music, in the mid-1960s. So he was already a pretty established figure when, in 1985, he decided to write a letter to the publishers of Morita Kazuro no Shogi, letting them know how much he enjoyed the game. That publisher was Enix, and once they realized who they had on their hands, they jumped at the chance of getting Sugiyama to write music for their games. He composed music for 2 Enix games, World Golf and Wingman 2, before making history with Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest was a match made in heaven for someone like Sugiyama. Inspired by wizardry and Ultima, Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii wanted to make a game with a more simplified scope to give it broader appeal. That's part of the reason why Horii brought on established figures like Akira Toriyama and Koichi Sugiyama. Released in November 1986, Dragon Quest was a smash hit, effectively creating the JRPG genre and establishing many of its conventions. For over 30 years now, Dragon Quest has been a juggernaut in Japan. Dragon Quest XI sold more than 2 million physical copies in Japan in just 2 days. For comparison, Super Mario Odyssey, which was worldwide the fastest-selling Mario game ever, only sold 500,000 copies in Japan in its first 3 days. Dragon Quest is big business. There's a reason why it's only released on Saturdays in Japan. Among other things, Dragon Quest raised the bar for a video game soundtrack, and a lot of that credit goes to Sugiyama. He has scored every mainline Dragon Quest and continually pushed the envelope by creating compositions that felt orchestral on a very limited hardware like the NES and SNES. The NES and other early video game consoles used a technology called MIDI, which we talk about in more detail in our video on plot composer Tim Follin, but in short, MIDI saves space on games by coding the notes that a system would play at a specific time, rather than including a fully pre-recorded song. This transitioned out with the rise of CD-based media, which had much more space than them cartridges. Today, in a video game context, when people say MIDI, they mean samples, or computer-generated sounds, rather than a pre-recorded song performed by a band. How can you tell if something's MIDI or not? It's the horns. It's always the horns. Sugiyama's music boasts a wide variety of styles, prominently Baroque, classical, and jazz. He's also credited for creating one of video games' first crescendos. Luminaries like Nobuo Uematsu, who composed for the Final Fantasy series for many years, call Sugiyama the big boss of video game music. Sugiyama claims he wrote the overture for Dragon Quest in 5 minutes, though he's quick to point out it was really 5 minutes and 50-odd years. One of Sugiyama's greatest talents was creating a composition that the NES could play that feels sweeping and epic. But since the NES and SNES were all MIDI, Sugiyama was all too happy to release multiple versions of the Dragon Quest soundtracks. Ballets, guitar, piano, string quartets, yada yada yada, multiple version releases for multiple games. Sugiyama also broke ground by putting on the first live concert performance of a video game soundtrack in 1987, to a sold-out crowd, I might add, a tradition which continues to this day. Not only is Dragon Quest big business, the music is big business. Why do we bring this up? Well, I mentioned that Sugiyama was born in 1931, right? Didn't even start composing Dragon Quest until his mid-50s. Well, the first mainline Dragon Quest game that came out on a CD-based system that could have theoretically contained a pre-recorded orchestral soundtrack was Dragon Quest VII for the PS1 in 2000. That's 14 years of being used to MIDI/electronic generated sounds. More specifically, that's 14 years of being used to multiple releases of soundtracks, concerts. Are you starting to see what I'm saying? Up to this point, the Dragon Quest games were largely handled by Enix, but this changed after Square and Enix merged in the mid-2000s. This changed things. For one thing, there was a lot more cash. This merger precipitated a few changes for fans of Dragon Quest music. For one thing, Japan, got our first release of orchestrated music in a Dragon Quest game for 2004's remake of Dragon Quest V on the PS2. It's maybe a little unfair to compare the original to this release, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Here's the SNES. Which, this is not amazing for the SNES, but it's not bad. But then, here's that PS2. No comparison, right? I'm not sure exactly what Square Enix had to do to license these orchestrated songs into the game, but I'd like to note that 2004 is coincidentally the same year that Sugi Label was formed by Sony Music Entertainment Japan. Its parent company is now King Records, but Sugi Label is still the label that publishes Dragon Quest soundtracks to this day. Now, the arguably most successful Dragon Quest game overseas is Dragon Quest VIII, which also came out in 2004, but it only received a symphonic soundtrack for its international localization. Its worldwide success is largely due to the care Square Enix put into the localization and promotion, but that Final Fantasy XII demo disc definitely didn't hurt. The Japanese version, which came out before the orchestrated soundtrack was released, had MIDI music. not bad. It's a pretty good version to release this game with. But here's the version the US got. All right, to me, it just doesn't compare. You might think that this would start a trend for orchestral soundtracks in Dragon Quest games, but spoilers, it didn't. Part of the reason for that is that even though Dragon Quest VIII was very successful, the success likely didn't live up to Square Enix's expectations, with only about 1 million units sold outside of Japan. That might be why they passed off 2009's Dragon Quest IX to Nintendo to publish outside of Japan, which sold about the same despite a more aggressive ad campaign.
You don't understand, it's Kelsey Weaver.
You know who does understand? Me. In Dragon Quest IX, I can choose from hundreds of outfits. I battle monsters in a fur poncho. That's my choice. What's yours?
Hi there.
Hey, great cape.
It's a poncho.
Choose your wardrobe, your weapons, your strategy. The adventure is yours. Dragon Quest IX, Sentinels of the Starry Skies. Rated everyone 10 and up.
No version of Dragon Quest IX was released with an orchestral soundtrack. We didn't get rumblings again of orchestras versus MIDIs in the Dragon Quest series for several years after, not until Dragon Quest VII and VIII got remade for Nintendo 3DS in 2013 and 2015 respectively in Japan. However, in a bit of a switcheroo, the Japanese versions of these games got some orchestrated tracks while the US releases did not. Honestly, the quality of the samples on Dragon Quest VII are not that bad. Here's the Japanese 3DS Dragon Quest VII. And here's that international version. It's, obviously the orchestra is better, but, this is acceptable. However, since Dragon Quest VIII already came out with a gorgeous symphonic soundtrack, Square Enix really needed to come correct to the 3DS. And yet, they didn't. Here's a comparison of the Japanese version compared to the international version. Okay, well, so what? Some of you might not even hear a difference. Or maybe it just doesn't even sound all that bad to you. Which, okay, I just don't understand, man. Like, the horns. It's all in the horns. Anyway, there's only one reason why Dragon Quest VII and VIII wouldn't have the same music across all versions. And it ain't lack of money. It ain't size restrictions. It ain't lack of demand. It's licensing issues. And, well, you already know who owns the licensing rights to Dragon Quest music. Sugiyama is a member and vocal supporter of JazzRack, aka the Japanese Society for Rights of Authors and Composers, which has almost a monopoly stranglehold on music rights in Japan, as well as a documented history of takedowns on YouTube. By the way, don't forget to support our Patreon. Oh my god, this video was a mistake. Sugiyama holds strong opinions on copyright and basically does not want to cede ownership of his songs in any way, like by allowing them to be sampled or rearranged without his permission. He also has some other strong opinions that we'll get to in a sec. Judging by the copyright information found on most Dragon Quest games, Sugiyama still has a tight grip on the rights to Dragon Quest music. He's also likely the cause of the Dragon Quest Heroes streaming controversy of 2015, where Twitch streamers were not allowed to stream Dragon Quest Heroes unless the music was silenced. The fact of the matter is that there's no legitimate reason to not have orchestrated tracks in Dragon Quest XI. The idea that I'm gonna sink 100 hours into this game but be subjected to this battle theme 1,000,000 times? What is the deal with the sample quality of these horns? These horns! Sugiyama actually defends using MIDI on his website. Basically, Sugiyama claims he uses electronic tones because it's what people expect. It's tradition. He also prefers it because it allows him to create compositions too complicated for an orchestra. That's an interesting claim since you actually don't seem to have a problem making arrangements for an orchestra, or a string quartet, or a single freaking piano. His next claim is that he needs to protect his business and control his copyright. I think this line of thinking is that he gets to pick where each version of the song should go, and he's decided that putting MIDI soundtracks in the game will sell other soundtracks. This is just ridiculous. The idea that people wouldn't buy soundtrack collections or go to concerts if they had access to the orchestral versions in the video game just makes no sense. The music means a lot to people, and those people would want to listen to the music when they want, not by playing through hours just to hear a certain track once. If more people had exposure to these songs, then more people would want to buy them. If anything, these games are advertisements for his performances and his CDs. Sure, it's expensive to record an orchestra, but if you're gonna do it anyway, what's the point of not delivering it to the consumer? Does he get off on this level of control? I mean, Sugiyama does have a history of wanting to exert control on the population. He's a part of a group in Japan that actively wants to rewrite the historical record on Japanese war crimes during World War II. And he believes so strongly in their cause that he paid for this advertisement in the Washington Post denying the scope of the Nanking Massacre and that Japan sexually enslaved thousands of women during World War II, even though the Japanese government has already acknowledged that this happened. He also doesn't believe that LGBT couples should have the same access to tax programs as hetero couples, and literally laughed on his own TV show at the idea that youth LGBT suicides are a problem that need to be addressed in schools. This one actually got kind of bad for him. The blowback for this was so bad that Square Enix, which is not affiliated with that TV show, felt the need to apologize and I'm sure had a hand in his own half-hearted apology. So not only is this guy unreasonable, he's also terrible. But he has been the head of all things Dragon Quest music for over 30 years. How could he ever be replaced? Well, he's not exactly Mozart or anything. The new compositions in Dragon Quest XI don't just have bad sound quality, they're also not that well written, especially compared to his earlier work. And you need something well written to sustain hours of gameplay. And honestly, there's not even that much new music. Dragon Quest XI's soundtrack features a lot of rehashing, which could be because Square Enix wanted to push this game as a send-up of 30 years of Dragon Quest, or perhaps it's because their composer is 87 years old. He actually does have an heir apparent. Hayato Matsuo, who composed music for Ogre Battle, Final Fantasy XII, and did orchestral arrangement for the Panzer Dragoon and Shenmue series, has worked with him for years and is considered to be the one who would take over for him after Sugiyama's death. Matsuo, by the way, is pro-orchestra over MIDI, even saying that live orchestra sounds much better and portrays emotion in a way that samplers just can't. He also doesn't actively deny war crimes or discriminate against minorities. Putting all of this together, it's hard to see the upsides for Square Enix to continue working with Sugiyama. I went into the making of this video trying to figure out why I was turning Dragon Quest XI's music down while I played it, and I'm left just feeling grossed out by this whole situation. It's clear that Sugiyama only cares about one thing: Sugiyama. This person put out a bad product just to sell records, which is not great, but I guess that's fine. But then look at how they used that money. This person tried to erase the suffering of thousands just because he found it inconvenient. No amount of tradition is worth that price. And knowing all of this, I'm just not confident this video isn't going to be taken down or demonetized. So thank you so much for watching. Please tell me what you think and subscribe. Thanks especially to all of the people who support this video on Patreon and made it possible for us to put it out. See you soon.